Hello, my dear listeners, and welcome back to another evening of shared stories and adventures. Tonight, we travel far from the familiar comforts of taverns and cozy cottages, journeying instead to a land of ancient wonder, where olive trees silver in the moonlight and the gods themselves once walked among mortals. This is a tale from the time when Greece was young, when shepherds still left offerings at crossroads, and the mountains held secrets that only the brave or the foolish dared to seek. Our story begins with a man named Alexios, a shepherd of no particular importance to anyone except his sheep, his neighbors, and perhaps the wind that knew his whistling tunes by heart. So settle in, pull your blankets close, and let us begin. The rooster belonging to old Stavros down the hill had a peculiar sense of timing. It crowed not at dawn, as any respectable rooster should, but rather at that strange grey hour when night has not quite surrendered to morning, and the stars still cling stubbornly to the sky. Alexios had long since stopped cursing the bird. After 7 years of this arrangement, he had come to think of it as simply part of the mountain's rhythm, like the bleating of his sheep or the whisper of wind through the cypress trees. He lay in his narrow bed for a moment longer, wrapped in woolen blankets that his grandmother had woven decades ago. The cottage was small, just one room really, with walls of whitewashed stone and a roof of terracotta tiles that clicked and shifted whenever a strong wind came down from the peaks. A hearth dominated one wall, its embers still glowing faintly from last night's fire. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the low ceiling beams, filling the air with the gentle scent of oregano and thyme. Alexios stretched, feeling his shoulders pop in that satisfying way that comes from a body accustomed to honest work. He was 28 years old, with dark hair that curled stubbornly no matter how he tried to tame it, and eyes the color of the Aegean Sea on a calm day. His hands were rough from handling rope and wool, his face weathered by sun and wind, and his smile came easily, the kind of smile that made strangers trust him and children follow him about asking for stories. He rose and padded across the packed earth floor to the small window, pushing open the wooden shutters. The morning greeted him with a rush of cool air, carrying with it the scent of wild sage and the distant salty hint of the sea far below. Mount Pelion stretched above him, its peaks still wearing caps of early morning mist like crowns of silver. Below, the terraced hillsides tumbled down toward the valley, olive groves alternating with patches of wildflowers in a patchwork of green and gold and purple. It was, Alexios thought, as he did every morning, a very fine place to live. His morning routine was as fixed as the stars. First he splashed cold water on his face from the clay jug by the door, gasping slightly at the chill. Then he pulled on his simple tunic, the off-white one with the small tear at the hem that he kept meaning to mend. His sandals were waiting by the door, leather-worn, soft from years of mountain paths. Finally, he took up his shepherd's staff, a length of olive wood polished smooth by his grip, curved at the top in the traditional style. Breakfast was simple but satisfying. he tore a chunk from the loaf of bread he had baked 2 days prior, its crust still reasonably crisp. Beside it, he set a small dish of honey from wild bees and a handful of dried figs. His grandmother had always said that a man who started his day with honey would find sweetness in whatever followed. And while Alexios was not certain this was literally true, he saw no reason to risk finding out otherwise. He ate standing at his doorway, watching the world wake up around him. The mist was beginning to lift now, revealing the full glory of the mountainside in the golden light of early morning. Somewhere in the distance, another rooster finally crowed, and Alexios smiled. At least Stavros's bird was not entirely alone in its confusion about the proper time for such things. From the small pen beside his cottage came the familiar sounds of his flock, stirring. He kept 30 sheep, which was enough to provide wool to sell in the village and milk for cheese, with occasional lambs to trade for other necessities. They were good sheep, mostly placid creatures with thick white coats and mild dispositions. He had named them all, though he would never admit this to anyone, for a grown man naming his sheep seemed somehow undignified. There was Cloud and Thistle, Storm and Sage. There was Wanderer, who lived up to her name constantly, and Old Grandfather, a ram of advanced years and tremendous dignity, who ruled the flock with benevolent authority. Alexios finished his breakfast, licked the last of the honey from his fingers, and went to release his charges for the day's grazing. The sheep emerged in a woolly flood, bleating their morning greetings, and he counted them automatically as they passed. 29, 30, all present and accounted for. "Good morning, my friends," he said, as he did every morning. Another fine day for eating grass and contemplating the mysteries of existence, yes. The sheep, as always, offered no philosophical insights in response. They simply began to spread out across the hillside, heads lowered to the abundant grass, tails flicking contentedly. Alexios followed at an easy pace, his staff tapping against the rocks, his eyes scanning the slopes for any sign of wolves or other dangers. The path he took today led upward toward the higher pastures where the grass grew sweetest in late spring. It wound through groves of ancient olive trees, their gnarled trunks twisted into shapes that his grandmother had always said were nymphs frozen in mid-dance. Past these, the path climbed through stands of cypress, tall and dark and solemn as priests at a temple. Wildflowers carpeted every open space, poppies like drops of blood against the green, tiny blue flowers whose name he had never learned, yellow blooms that attracted fat, lazy bees. Alexios breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the clean mountain air, and felt a profound contentment settle over him. There were men, he knew, who would find this life unbearably dull, men who craved adventure, who sought glory in battle or wealth in distant cities. He understood this desire in an abstract way, but he had never shared it. What adventure could compare to watching the sun rise over these ancient hills? What glory could match the simple satisfaction of bringing his flock safely home at day's end? His grandmother had understood this about him. She had raised him, after his parents died in a fever when he was only 7, and she had never once tried to make him into something he was not. Instead, she had filled his head with stories of the old gods and their wild deeds, stories of heroes and monsters, of nymphs and satyrs, of the time when the world was young and magic lived in every stream and stone. Alexios still remembered those evenings by the fire, his grandmother's voice rising and falling with the flames, her wrinkled hands gesturing as she spoke. She told him of mighty Zeus, king of the gods, who hurled thunderbolts from the peak of Mount Olympus, of beautiful Aphrodite, born from the foam of the sea, whose laughter could make even the sternest warrior's heart grow soft, of clever Hermes, the messenger god, who wore winged sandals and carried a staff entwined with serpents, and who was known to walk among mortals in disguise, testing their hospitality and rewarding their kindness. Always be kind to strangers, his grandmother had told him more times than he could count. You never know when you might be entertaining a god unawares. Alexios had taken this advice to heart. He shared his bread with wandering travelers, offered shelter to those caught in mountain storms, gave directions to lost pilgrims seeking the old shrines. It was simply the right thing to do, he felt, regardless of whether any gods were watching. Though he had to admit part of him had always hoped they were. The sun climbed higher as the morning wore on, burning away the last of the mist and bathing the mountainside in warm golden light. Alexios found a comfortable rock and settled onto it, keeping one eye on his grazing flock while letting his mind wander. The sheep were content, the day was fine, and for a little while there was nothing that required his immediate attention. He pulled from his pouch a small wooden flute, crudely carved by his own hands, but capable of producing a reasonable approximation of music. He had been working on a new tune, something to match the mood of a morning like this one, bright and peaceful and full of quiet possibility. The melody emerged in fits and starts, a few notes at a time, as he experimented with different combinations. The sheep, he had noticed over the years, seemed to appreciate his playing, or at least they did not object to it, which was nearly the same thing. They continued their grazing, their gentle bleating, providing a sort of accompaniment to his music. Time passed pleasantly. The sun moved across the sky, shadows shifting and lengthening. Alexios played his flute, watched his sheep, and occasionally walked among them to ensure none had wandered too far. It was, in every respect, an ordinary day, and yet there was something not quite ordinary about it, a feeling in the air that he could not quite name, a sort of tension, like the breathless moment before a summer storm breaks. The sheep felt it too, he noticed. They were more restless than usual, lifting their heads frequently to stare at nothing, their ears twitching at sounds only they could hear. "Oh, what is it, my friends?" Alexios asked, rising from his rock and scanning the hillside. "What has you all so nervous?" He saw nothing unusual. The same trees, the same flowers, the same distant glimmer of the sea. No wolves prowled the edges of his vision, no eagles circled overhead. And yet the feeling persisted, a strange prickling at the back of his neck, as if unseen eyes were watching from somewhere just beyond his perception. That night, as he herded his flock back down to the cottage and secured them in their pen, Alexios noticed something else unusual. Lights on the mountain peaks. They were faint, easy to miss if you are not looking for them. Flickering glimmers of gold and silver, dancing among the highest crags where no mortal fire could burn. Alexios had seen such lights before on rare occasions, always dismissed them as tricks of starlight or reflections of the moon. But tonight they seemed brighter, more deliberate, almost as if someone or something was signaling. He stood at his doorway for a long time, watching those distant lights flicker and dance. His grandmother's stories whispered in his memory, tales of gods who gathered on mountaintops, of sacred meetings held in places beyond mortal reach. Nonsense, he told himself firmly. Probably just lightning or moonlight on stone. But as he closed his door and settled into his bed, pulling his grandmother's blankets up to his chin, Alexios could not quite shake the feeling that something had changed, that the world he knew, the simple, peaceful world of sheep and mountains and sunlit days, was about to become rather more complicated. The rooster would crow again in a few hours, and tomorrow would be another day of grazing and watching and playing his flute among the wild flowers. But somehow, lying there in the darkness with the embers dying in his hearth and those strange lights still flickering behind his closed eyes, Alexios suspected that tomorrow would be different. He just did not know how different yet. Sleep came eventually, carrying him away on dreams of silver olive leaves and gods with winged sandals, of music that made the stars dance and lights that led the way to wonders unknown. And far above, on the peaks of Mount Pelion, those mysterious lights continued their silent vigil, waiting for morning and whatever it might bring. The next morning arrived with its usual symphony of sounds, the rooster's premature announcement, the stirring of sheep in their pen, the whisper of wind through the cypress trees. But Alexios woke with a strange sense of anticipation, as if the day itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He went through his morning routine with perhaps less attention than usual, his mind still lingering on those mysterious lights he had seen dancing on the mountain peaks. In the bright clarity of morning they seemed less real, more like something from a half-remembered dream. And yet, the feeling of wrongness, of something being slightly off about the world, had not faded with the night. His sheep noticed it too. As he released them from their pen, they emerged with unusual caution, clustering together more tightly than normal, their heads swiveling to track sounds and movements that Alexios himself could not detect. Even old grandfather, who normally led the flock with serene confidence, seemed hesitant, his great curved horns turning this way and that, as if searching for an enemy he could not quite locate. "Easy now," Alexios murmured, running his hand along the old ram's woolly back. "Nothing to fear. Just another day of grass and sunshine." But he was not entirely certain he believed his own words. The morning passed without incident, though the strange atmosphere persisted. Alexios led his flock to the eastern pastures today, where a stream provided fresh water, and the grass grew particularly sweet. He settled into his usual rhythm of watching and waiting, playing occasional melodies on his flute, counting and recounting his charges to ensure none had strayed. It was nearly midday when he noticed that one had done exactly that. Wanderer, true to her name, had disappeared. Alexios cursed softly under his breath. The ewe had a talent for finding gaps in his attention and exploiting them ruthlessly. She was never content with the grass beneath her hooves, always convinced that greener pastures lay just over the next ridge, just around the next bend. He had retrieved her from ravines, from thickets, from places no sensible sheep should ever have reached. He left the rest of the flock in old grandfather's capable supervision and set off in search of the wayward ewe. Her trail was not difficult to follow. Fresh droppings here, a tuft of white wool caught on a bramble there, the marks of small hooves in the soft earth beside the stream. She had gone upward, as she usually did, climbing toward the higher slopes where the grass was sparse, but the sense of adventure apparently irresistible. Alexios climbed after her, his staff helping him navigate the increasingly rocky terrain. The path grew narrower, the vegetation thicker. He passed through groves of ancient oaks whose branches interlaced overhead, creating a canopy so dense that only scattered coins of sunlight reached the forest floor. The air grew cooler, damper, filled with the green scent of moss and the whisper of leaves. He had lived on this mountain all his life, had walked its slopes since before he could properly walk at all. He knew every path, every stream, every notable rock and twisted tree, or so he had always believed. But as he pushed through a particularly dense thicket of wild olive, ducking beneath branches heavy with unripe fruit, he emerged into a place he had never seen before. It was a grove, but grove seemed too ordinary a word for what lay before him. It was more like a temple that nature itself had built, a sacred space formed from living things rather than stone. Ancient olive trees ringed the clearing, their trunks thick as pillars, their branches spreading overhead to form a silver-green dome. But these were not ordinary olives. Their leaves shimmered with an inner light, catching the sun and throwing it back in sparkles of silver and gold. Their bark was pale as bone, carved with patterns that might have been natural grain, or might have been something else entirely. In the center of the grove stood a spring. Water bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks, clear as crystal and somehow luminous, as if light lived within the water itself rather than merely reflecting from its surface. The pool it formed was perfectly round, edged with smooth white stones, and Alexios could see all the way to its bottom, where small fish darted like living jewels. The air here was different, cleaner somehow, and charged with a kind of energy that made the hair on his arms stand upright. Every breath felt like drinking wine, heady and intoxicating. The sounds of the ordinary world, the birdsong and insect buzz and wind whisper, seemed muffled here, as if this grove existed slightly apart from the rest of reality. Wanderers stood at the edge of the pool drinking calmly, as if she had not just led him on a chase through half the mountain. She looked up at his approach, water dripping from her woolly chin, and bleated once in what might have been greeting or might have been reproach for taking so long to find her. "Ah, you impossible creature," Alexios breathed, but he was not really paying attention to the sheep. He was too busy staring at everything else, trying to convince himself that this place was real, that he was not dreaming or hallucinating or suffering from too much sun. He stepped further into the grove, moving slowly, reverently. The grass beneath his sandals was soft as velvet, starred with tiny white flowers he did not recognize. The silver light filtering through the olive leaves cast strange shadows, moving shadows that did not quite correspond to the movement of the branches above. And there was a sound now, just at the edge of hearing. Music, perhaps? Or something like music. A humming, a harmony, as if the grove itself was singing a song too subtle for mortal ears to fully grasp. Alexios approached the spring and knelt beside it, cupping his hands to drink. The water was cold and sweet and unlike anything he had ever tasted, clean in a way that went beyond mere purity, as if he was drinking starlight or morning mist given liquid form. He felt it spread through him, washing away fatigue and worry, leaving clarity in its wake. He was still kneeling there, marveling at this impossible place, when he heard the voices. They came from beyond a screen of hanging vines at the far end of the grove. 3 distinct speakers engaged in what sounded like an argument. Alexios froze, his heart suddenly pounding. He should leave. He knew he should leave, whatever business was being conducted in this sacred space. It was clearly not meant for mortal ears. But curiosity held him rooted to the spot, and instead of retreating, he crept forward, parting the vines just enough to peer through. 3 figures stood in a smaller clearing beyond, gathered around a stone altar that glowed with faint blue fire. The first was a young man, or something that looked like a young man, dressed in a short traveling cloak and wearing sandals with small wings at the ankles. His features were sharp and clever, his eyes bright with mischief, and he moved with a quicksilver grace that made him seem to flicker rather than simply stand still. He was gesturing emphatically as he spoke. "I am telling you, it is getting worse. I traveled through 7 villages yesterday, and not one of them had made an offering at their crossroads shrine. Not even a handful of grain. The altars are cold, the sacred stones are overgrown, and the people walk past without even glancing at them. The second figure was a woman, though not quite a woman. Her skin had a greenish tint, like light filtering through spring leaves, and her hair was a cascade of vines and flowers that moved of its own accord, independent of any breeze. She was lovely in an inhuman way, her features too perfect, too symmetrical, as if carved by an artist who had never seen actual flesh and blood. "The forests feel it too," she said, her voice like wind through branches. "The old groves are shrinking. The nymphs are fewer each year. Some of my sisters have faded entirely, become nothing more than echoes in the trees where they once danced." The third figure was oldest of all, though what age meant for such a being, Alexios could not begin to guess. He had the legs of a goat covered in coarse grey fur, and the torso and face of an elderly man. Small horns curled from his temples, and his beard was long and tangled with bits of leaf and twig. He leaned heavily on a staff of twisted wood, and when he spoke, his voice was weary. It was always thus, the old creature said. Belief rises and falls like the tides. There have been dark ages before, times when the altars went untended and the sacred fires dimmed. But we endured. We always endure. This is different, Silenus, the young man with winged sandals insisted. This is not merely a low tide. This is the sea itself retreating. I can feel it in my very essence. The connections that bind us to the mortal world are fraying. Soon they will snap entirely, and then... He trailed off, shaking his head. Then what? The green woman asked softly. What happens to us when the last mortal forgets our names? Silence fell over the clearing, heavy and oppressive. The blue fire on the altar flickered, dimmed, nearly went out before rallying feebly. Alexios leaned forward, straining to hear more, and his foot came down on a dry twig. The cracks seemed impossibly loud in the sacred silence. All three figures spun towards the sound, and Alexios found himself looking directly into the eyes of the young man with winged sandals. Those eyes were ancient, far older than the youthful face that held them, and they seemed to see straight through to his soul. Well, well, the young man said, and his voice carried a note of amusement beneath the surprise. It seems we have a listener. Alexios's legs refused to obey his desperate command to run. He stood frozen as the winged sandal man approached, moving with that unsettling fluid grace, and stopped directly before him. A shepherd, the man observed, taking in Alexios's rough clothing, his staff, his thoroughly terrified expression. From the village below, I would guess. You have wandered quite far from your pastures, little mortal. I was only looking for my sheep, Alexios managed, his voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. She strayed. I followed. I did not mean to intrude. I swear it. I will leave at once. I will tell no one what I have seen, please. He was babbling, he knew, words tumbling out in a panicked stream. The green woman had drifted closer, regarding him with curiosity rather than anger. The old goat-legged man remained by the altar, watching with an expression that might have been concern or might have been indigestion. The winged sandal man held up a hand, silencing Alexios's desperate apologies. Peace, shepherd. You are in no danger. We do not make a habit of smiting mortals who stumble upon us by accident. He smiled, a quicksilver flash of genuine amusement. Usually. My lord, the green woman said softly, he heard us speaking. He knows of the fading. Yes, the winged sandal man agreed, studying Alexios with those ancient knowing eyes. He does. And yet, I sense something interesting about this one. Something that sets him apart from the countless mortals I pass each day without a second glance. He tilted his head, as if listening to something only he could hear. There is belief in you, shepherd, true belief, not the hollow recitation of words learned by rote. You remember the old stories. You honor the old ways. My grandmother, Alexios said, finding his voice at last. She told me stories about the gods, about heroes, about the time when... He gestured helplessly at the grove around them. About places like this. I thought they were just tales. Beautiful tales, but still only tales. And now, Alexios looked at the shimmering olive trees, at the luminous spring, at the three impossible beings who stood before him in a place that should not exist. Now, he said slowly, I think perhaps my grandmother was wiser than I ever knew. The winged sandal man laughed, a sound like bells chiming in a fresh wind. I like you, shepherd, he said. I think perhaps that you might be exactly what we need. Alexios stood in the sacred grove, surrounded by beings from his grandmother's stories made impossibly flesh, and tried very hard not to faint. His heart was hammering against his ribs, his palms were slick with nervous sweat, and some distant part of his mind was insisting that this must all be a dream brought on by bad cheese or too much sun. But the grass beneath his feet was real, the cool air of the grove was real, and the eyes of the god before him were far too knowing to be any dream. Exactly what you need, he repeated weakly. My lord, I am only a shepherd. I tend sheep. I play a wooden flute poorly and make cheese that is merely adequate. I cannot imagine what use I could possibly be to beings such as yourselves. The winged sandal man, whom Alexios had by now recognized from his grandmother's descriptions as Hermes himself, messenger of the gods, smiled with what seemed like genuine warmth. Come, Hermes said, gesturing toward the central clearing. Sit with us, drink from the spring. Let us talk like civilized beings rather than standing about gaping at each other like strangers at a crossroads. Alexios allowed himself to be led back to where the green woman and the old satyr waited. Someone, he was not sure who, pressed a cup of that impossibly clear water into his hands. He drank without thinking, and felt the cool liquid spread through him, calming his racing heart, clearing the fog of panic from his mind. I am Hermes, the young god confirmed, settling onto a moss-covered rock with casual grace. Though you had already guessed as much, I suspect. My companions are Daphne, who tends to the groves and streams of this mountain, and Silenus, who is older than the stones and wiser than he pretends to be. Not wiser, the old satyr grumbled, just more tired. Daphne, the green woman, had perched herself on the edge of the luminous pool, her bare feet trailing in the water. Up close, Alexios could see that her fingers ended in delicate green leaves instead of nails, and that small flowers bloomed and withered in her hair in cycles too fast for nature. You heard what we were discussing, Hermes said, and it was not a question. The fading, the weakening of the bonds between your world and ours. Alexios nodded, not trusting his voice. For thousands of years, Hermes continued, mortals and gods have existed in a kind of partnership. You gave us your belief, your prayers, your offerings, not because we demanded them, though some of my family have been known to be rather insistent on such matters, but because that belief sustained us. It gave us strength, purpose, connection to the world we helped to shape. And in return, Daphne added softly, We gave you magic, wonder, the sense that the world was alive with possibility, that every stream might hold a nymph, every grove a spirit, every storm the hand of divine will. But now, Hermes said, his quicksilver smile fading, that partnership is breaking down. Mortals turn away from the old ways. They forget our names, neglect our altars, dismiss our stories as childish fantasies, and as they forget, we diminish. My sisters fade, Daphne whispered, and there was ancient grief in her voice. I remember when every spring on this mountain had its guardian spirit. Now so many are gone, dissolved back into the water and the stone, leaving only echoes where once there was song. Selena stamped one hoofed foot against the ground. The young ones do not remember how it was. They think this thinning is natural, inevitable. But I remember the golden age when gods walked openly among mortals, when every village knew our names and honored our presence. This darkness is not natural. It is a wound, and it is growing deeper. Alexios listened to all of this with a growing sense of wonder and sorrow. He thought of the abandoned shrines he passed on mountain paths, their offerings of flowers long since rotted away. He thought of his neighbors, who smiled politely when he mentioned the old stories, but clearly thought him touched in the head for believing in such things. He thought of his grandmother, one of the last in her village, who still left bread at the crossroads and poured wine on the earth before drinking. "But I do not understand," he said finally. "What can be done? You cannot force people to believe. Belief is not a thing that can be commanded." Hermes leaned forward, his ancient eyes intent on Alexios's face. "No," he agreed. "Belief cannot be commanded, but it can be rekindled. There are 3 sacred flames, shepherd, 3 fires that have burned since the beginning of our time on this earth. One at the great temple of Delphi, where Apollo speaks through his oracle. One in the forges of Hephaestus beneath the burning mountain. One in the temple of Poseidon by the sea. These flames are connected to the hearts of the gods themselves. While they burn, the bonds between our worlds endure. And these flames," Alexios said slowly, beginning to understand, "they are failing. They are. One by one, as belief fades, they flicker and dim. Soon they will go out entirely. And when they do," Hermes spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness that seemed deeply wrong on a god, "we do not know exactly what will happen. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. Perhaps we will simply cease to be, fading like morning mist when the sun rises. Or perhaps it will be worse. Perhaps the loss of divine order will unleash chaos upon the world, the old monsters returning, the old darkness creeping back." Alexios felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cool air of the grove. "You need someone to rekindle these flames," he said. "And you think that someone should be me." "I think," Hermes replied carefully, "that you are one of the few mortals left who still has true belief in your heart. Not superstition, not habit, but genuine faith in the wonder and magic of the world. That belief is itself a kind of power, shepherd. It can open doors that are closed to others, kindle fires that would not catch from an ordinary spark." "But why me?" Alexios pressed. "Surely there are others. priests and priestesses who serve your temples, holy men and women who dedicate their lives to the gods." Hermes' smile turned sad. "Most of those who serve in our temples do so from tradition, not belief. They recite the prayers, perform the rituals, maintain the forms, but their hearts are not truly in it. They go through the motions because it is expected of them, not because they feel the presence of the divine in their souls." He reached out and touched Alexios' chest, just over his heart. "You are different. You believe because you cannot help but believe, because the wonder of the world has never faded for you, despite everything that might have dimmed it. That is rare, shepherd, rarer than you know." Alexios sat in silence for a long moment, trying to process everything he had heard. Part of him wanted to refuse, to insist that he was not the right person for such a task, to go back to his sheep and his cottage and his simple life and pretend this strange morning had never happened. But another part of him, the part that still thrilled to his grandmother's stories, that saw magic in every sunrise and mystery in every shadow, that part could not walk away from this. "If I agree to help," he said slowly, "what would I need to do?" Hermes exchanged a glance with his companions, and something that might have been hope flickered in his quicksilver eyes. "Travel to each of the 3 sacred sites," he said. "Find your way to the flames, and once there, do what only a true believer can do. Offer your faith, your heart, your genuine reverence. The flames will respond to sincerity where they would reject any lesser offering." "It will be dangerous," Daphne warned. "The paths to these places are not easy, even in the best of times. And these are not the best of times. As our power wanes, other things grow stronger. Old things, hungry things that we once kept in check. You would be walking into the unknown," Silenus added, his ancient eyes heavy with concern. "Facing challenges that no shepherd should have to face. And there would be no guarantee of success. You might fail, you might die. You might reach the flames only to find that they are beyond rekindling." But," Hermes said, "if you succeed, you will have saved not just us, but the very capacity for wonder in the mortal world. And that is no small thing." Alexios looked down at his hands, rough and calloused from years of honest work. These were not the hands of a hero. These were the hands of a man who mended fences and sheared wool and made cheese that was merely adequate. What business did hands like these have kindling sacred flames and saving gods? And yet his grandmother had always told him that heroes came in all shapes and sizes, that the great tales were full of unlikely champions, simple folk who rose to meet extraordinary challenges not because they were special, but because they happened to be in the right place at the right time, and had the courage not to look away. "My sheep," he said finally. "I cannot simply abandon them." Hermes smiled, and there was approval in that smile, respect for a man whose first thought, in the face of cosmic crisis, was for the creatures in his care. "Your neighbor, the old man with the olive grove. Nikolaos, is it? He will care for them in your absence. I will see to it that his own work thrives in exchange, that his trees bear fruit beyond any season he has known." "And when I return?" Alexios asked. "If I return, then you will have your flock, your cottage, your simple life, all waiting for you just as you left them." Hermes paused. "And you will have something more, a boon, a wish, a gift from the gods in thanks for your service. Whatever you desire within my power to grant." Alexios thought about this for a moment, then shook his head. "I do not do this for a reward," he said quietly. "I do it because it is right, because my grandmother would have done it had she been given the chance, because I cannot stand by and watch the wonder drain from the world while I have the power to prevent it." Hermes' smile widened into something genuine, something almost surprised. "Well spoken, shepherd. Well spoken indeed." He rose from his mossy seat and extended his hand. "Do we have an agreement, then? Will you be our champion in this darkening hour?" Alexios looked at that offered hand, the hand of a god, and thought of all the tales his grandmother had told him, of ordinary people who stepped into extraordinary circumstances, of farmers who became kings, of shepherds who became heroes, of simple folk whose names echoed through eternity, because they had the courage to say yes when destiny came calling. He took the hand and clasped it firmly. "I will try," he said. "Oh, that is all I can promise. I will try." "That is all anyone can do," Hermes replied, "and often it is enough." The bargain was sealed. What followed was a flurry of preparations that left Alexios' head spinning. Hermes produced 3 gifts, seemingly from thin air, each designed to aid him on his journey. The first was a feather, long and silver white, that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "This will always point the way north," Hermes explained. "In strange lands and dark places, when you have lost your path, trust in this, and it will guide you." The second was a small leather pouch that, when Alexios opened it, contained what appeared to be an ordinary loaf of bread. "It will never go stale," Hermes said, "and no matter how much you eat, there will always be more. Simple fare, I admit, but you will never go hungry on the road." The third was a small wooden lyre, exquisitely crafted despite its humble size, with strings that shimmered like spun moonlight. "This plays itself," Hermes said with a hint of pride. "Simply hold it and think of the music you wish to hear, and it will respond. Music has power, shepherd, more power than you might imagine. There may come times when a song succeeds where strength would fail." Alexios accepted each gift with wonder, tucking them carefully into his shepherd's pouch. The feather he wrapped in a scrap of cloth to protect its delicate barbs. The bread he placed beside his own meager supplies. The lyre fit perfectly in his palm, warm to the touch despite the cool air of the grove. "Begin at Delphi," Hermes advised. "It's the closest of the 3 sites, and perhaps the least dangerous, though do not let that make you complacent. The Oracle still speaks, though few now come to listen. Seek the flame in the temple's heart, and let your faith be your offering. And after Delphi, the forge of Hephaestus, beneath the burning mountain to the west, then finally, the temple of Poseidon by the sea. The order matters. Each flame you rekindle will strengthen you for the next, will make the path a little clearer, the darkness a little less absolute. Alexios nodded, committing this to memory. Delphi first, then the forge, then the sea. 3 flames, 3 journeys, 1 impossible mission for an entirely ordinary shepherd. I should go, he said, rising to his feet. The day is passing, and if I am to arrange for my sheep's care and prepare for travel, I have much to do. Your sheep, Daphne said, rising as well, and gesturing to where wanderers still graze contentedly by the pool, will find their own way home. The grove knows them now, and will guide their steps. She smiled, and it was like watching flowers bloom. Take care of yourself, shepherd. The world needs more like you. Silenus had fallen asleep at some point during the conversation, snoring softly against his twisted staff. Hermes shook his head with fond exasperation. Do not mind him. He has earned his rest after so many ages. The god walked Alexios to the edge of the grove, to where the ordinary forest began, and the magic faded into mundane reality. I can't accompany you on this journey. The rules that govern our existence do not permit direct intervention in mortal affairs, but I will be watching. And when you have need of guidance, look to the wind. Sometimes, if you listen carefully, it carries more than just air. Alexios stepped across the threshold, feeling the change immediately. The air grew warmer, heavier, less charged with that strange electric potential. The silver glow faded from the olive leaves. The world was ordinary again, or at least as ordinary as it could ever be, now that he knew what lay hidden within it. He looked back one last time. Hermes stood at the edge of the grove, his winged sandals hovering just above the grass, his quicksilver smile bright against the shadows. Good luck, Alexios of Mount Pelion, the god called. May your faith carry you through the darkness and into the light beyond. And then the vines closed, the light faded, and Alexios was alone with the trees and the birdsong, and the weight of an impossible quest settled firmly on his shoulders. He began the long walk home, his mind churning with everything he had learned and everything that lay ahead. Behind him, Wanderer bleated once and followed, apparently deciding that the sacred grove was lovely, but not quite as appealing as wherever her shepherd might be going. Some things, Alexios thought with a tired smile, never changed. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Alexios returned to his cottage to find Wanderer already there, grazing contentedly in her pen, as if she had never led him on a chase through half the mountain to stumble upon hidden groves and arguing gods. The rest of his flock surrounded her, bleating their welcome, utterly unaware that their shepherd's life had just become considerably more complicated. His first task was to speak with old Nikolaos. His neighbor lived just down the slope in a cottage surrounded by gnarled olive trees that had been producing fruit since before either of them was born. Nikolaos was 73 years old, with a face like crumbled leather and eyes that still sparkled with sharp intelligence. He had known Alexios's grandmother, had in fact courted her briefly in their youth before she chose another, and he treated Alexios with the gruff affection of an uncle who had never quite gotten around to having children of his own. "You want me to watch your sheep," Nikolaos repeated, after Alexios had explained his need to travel, fabricating a story about a distant relative who needed assistance. For how long? I am not certain, Alexios admitted. A few weeks, perhaps longer. I know it is a great deal to ask. Nikolaos studied him with those sharp old eyes, and Alexios had the uncomfortable feeling that the old man saw right through his hastily constructed lie. But Nikolaos did not press the matter. Instead, he simply nodded. Your grandmother was good to me in our younger days, helped me through a difficult time when I thought the world had ended. I never properly repaid that debt. He clapped Alexios on the shoulder with a hand that was still surprisingly strong. Go do whatever it is you need to do, boy. Your flock will be here when you return. And that was that. No questions, no protests, just quiet acceptance and the implicit understanding that some things did not need to be explained. Alexios spent the remaining time preparing for his journey. He had never traveled farther than the market town in the valley below, had never been more than a day's walk from the cottage where he was born. The wider world was a mystery to him, known only through stories and the occasional tale from traveling merchants. He packed carefully, mindful of both weight and necessity, a spare tunic, a woolen cloak for cold nights, his good sandals with the thick soles for long walking, his knife, a length of rope, a fire-starting kit of flint and steel and charcloth. The magical gifts from Hermes went in a special pouch at his belt, where he could feel their reassuring weight against his hip. The ever-full bread, the guiding feather, the self-playing lyre. His shepherd's staff he debated leaving behind, but in the end decided to take it. It had been his constant companion for years, an extension of his own body, and the thought of traveling without it felt wrong. Besides, a good staff was useful for more than just herding sheep. It could serve as a walking stick on rough terrain, a weapon against wild animals or bandits, a pole for testing uncertain ground. On the morning of his departure, Alexios rose before the false dawn rooster could begin his premature crowing. He stood in the doorway of his cottage one last time, looking out at the mountain he had known all his life. The slopes were silver with dew in the pre-dawn light. The cypress trees stood like dark sentinels against the slowly brightening sky. In the distance he could just make out the shimmer of the sea. I will come back, he said softly, to the cottage, to the mountain, to the sheep still sleeping in their pen. This is my home. Nothing will change that. Then he shouldered his pack, gripped his staff, and set off down the path toward the valley and the road that would carry him to Delphi. The first day of travel was, Alexios had to admit, rather pleasant. The road from Mount Pelion wound down through olive groves and past small farms, crossing streams on ancient stone bridges and passing through villages where dogs barked and children waved and women hanging laundry paused to watch the stranger with a shepherd's staff go by. The weather was fine, warm but not hot, with a breeze that carried the scent of wild herbs and ripening fruit. Alexios fell into an easy rhythm of walking, his legs carrying him forward while his mind wandered freely. He thought about the sacred grove, about the worried faces of the gods, about the three flames waiting to be rekindled. He thought about his grandmother and her stories about all the times she had told him that the old ways still mattered, that faith was never wasted even when it seemed to go unanswered. He wondered if she had known somehow that he would one day be called upon to prove the truth of her teachings. By late afternoon, he had reached the market town of Volos, the largest settlement he had ever seen. It was not, by any objective measure, a great city. Perhaps 2,000 people lived within its walls, with another 1,000 or so scattered through the surrounding countryside. But to Alexios, who had never seen more than 50 people gathered in one place, it seemed impossibly vast and overwhelming. The streets were crowded with merchants hawking their wares, with craftsmen at their workbenches, with sailors fresh from the port smelling of salt and tar in distant places. The noise was incredible, a constant wash of voices and animals and creaking cartwheels that never quite faded no matter which way he turned. The smells were equally overwhelming. Cooking food and animal dung and spices and unwashed bodies all mingling into something that was not exactly pleasant, but was undeniably alive. Alexios navigated through the chaos as best he could, asking directions to the western gate and the road that would eventually lead to Delphi. The locals were helpful enough, pointing him down this street and around that corner, commenting on his shepherd's staff and his rural accent with varying degrees of kindness. By the time he reached the western gate and passed through into the countryside beyond, he felt he had already had quite enough of city life. The road westward was less traveled than the one he had followed down from the mountain. It wound through wilder country, past rocky hillsides where goats scrambled, and through forests of oak and pine that were darker and older than anything on Pelion. The villages grew smaller and farther apart. The people he passed became fewer, and those he did meet seemed more cautious, more inclined to hurry past with their eyes averted. On the second night, Alexios camped beside a stream in a small clearing, building a fire from dead wood and cooking a simple meal of the magical bread supplemented with some dried fish he had purchased in Volos. The bread was extraordinary. No matter how much he tore away and ate, there was always more, and it was always perfectly fresh, with a taste like the best baking he had ever known, warm and satisfying, and somehow exactly what he was hungry for. As he ate, he became aware that he was not alone. The feeling crept over him gradually, a prickle at the back of his neck, a sense of being watched from somewhere just beyond the firelight. He reached slowly for his staff, his eyes scanning the darkness, his heart beginning to beat faster. "Peace, traveler," said a voice from the shadows. "I mean no harm." A figure emerged into the light. It was a man, or appeared to be, dressed in the rough clothes of a wandering tinker, with a pack on his back and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. He was neither young nor old, neither tall nor short, with features so ordinary that Alexios felt he would forget them the moment he looked away. "May I share your fire?" the stranger asked. "The night is cold, and I have been walking since dawn." Alexios hesitated. His grandmother's words echoed in his memory. "Always be kind to strangers. You never know when you might be entertaining a god unawares. But she had also warned him of bandits and tricksters, of those who use the appearance of helplessness to lure the unwary into traps. In the end, hospitality won out over caution. "Please," Alexios said, gesturing to a spot across the fire. "Sit and warm yourself. I have bread to share if you are hungry." The stranger settled onto the ground with a grateful sigh, removing his hat to reveal a face that was weathered by travel, but not unkind. His eyes, Alexios noticed, were an unusual shade of grey, like storm clouds over the sea. "You are traveling to Delphi," the stranger said. It was not a question. Alexios tensed. "How do you know that?" "I am a tinker," the man replied with a slight smile. "I travel these roads constantly, talking to everyone I meet. Word spreads quickly among the wandering folk. A shepherd from Mount Pelion, heading west toward the Oracle sanctuary. An unusual journey, for an unusual time." Alexios relaxed slightly. It was a reasonable explanation, even if something about the stranger still felt off. He tore a piece from his magical bread and offered it across the fire. The stranger accepted it with thanks and ate slowly, savoring each bite. "Why do you seek the Oracle?" the stranger asked. "The temple sees few pilgrims these days. Most have decided that the gods have nothing left to say." Alexios considered his answer carefully. "I believe otherwise," he said finally. "I think the gods still speak, for those who have ears to listen." The stranger's grey eyes glinted in the firelight. "A rare sentiment in these skeptical times. What gives you such faith?" "My grandmother," Alexios replied. "She taught me the old stories, showed me how to honor the old ways she believed until the day she died, and I see no reason to abandon that belief simply because it has become unfashionable." The stranger was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Your grandmother was a wise woman," he said at last. "Wiser than most. The world would be a better place if more had her faith." He looked up, meeting Alexios's eyes directly. "You will face trials on this journey, shepherd. Tests of courage, of wisdom, of heart. Do not lose faith when the path grows dark. The gods have not forgotten those who remember them." Before Alexios could respond, the stranger rose smoothly to his feet, replacing his hat and shouldering his pack. "I must continue on my way," he said. "Thank you for the bread and the fire and the company. May your journey bring you to where you need to be." And then, without waiting for a reply, he walked into the darkness beyond the firelight and was gone. Alexios blinked, straining his eyes to follow the stranger's path, but there was no sign of him. No footsteps, no rustling in the underbrush, no sound at all except the crackle of the fire and the distant hooting of an owl. Alexios sat by his fire for a long time after that, thinking about grey eyes and cryptic words and the strange feeling that he had just been tested, or blessed, or perhaps both. The rest of his journey to Delphi passed without further unusual encounters, though the landscape grew increasingly dramatic as he traveled west. The mountains rose higher, their peaks disappearing into clouds. The valleys grew deeper, carved by ancient rivers into dramatic gorges, and everywhere there was a sense of age, of layers upon layers of history pressing down on the land, of countless generations who had walked these paths before him, seeking wisdom, seeking guidance, seeking connection to something greater than themselves. On the 5th day of his journey, Alexios crested a ridge and saw Delphi for the first time. The sanctuary clung to the side of Mount Parnassus like a village built by giants, terraces and temples rising one above the other toward the sky. Even from a distance he could see the great columns of the Temple of Apollo gleaming white against the dark mountainside. Below it, a theatre carved from living rock curved like a cupped hand, and above it, a stadium crowned the heights, where athletes had once competed for divine glory. But the glory was faded now. Even from here, Alexios could see that many of the smaller buildings had fallen into ruin, their roofs collapsed, their walls crumbling. The sacred way that wound up through the sanctuary was overgrown with weeds. The treasure houses that had once held offerings from grateful cities stood empty, their doors hanging open. Alexios stood on that ridge for a long time, looking at this monument to a faith that was slowly dying. He thought about the flames he had come to rekindle, about the gods who were fading as belief faded, about the weight of the task that had been placed upon an ordinary shepherd's shoulders. Then he squared those shoulders, gripped his staff, and began the final descent toward the heart of ancient prophecy. Alexios entered the sanctuary of Delphi as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the ancient stones and painting the columns of the great temple in shades of gold and amber. The sacred way wound upward through the ruins, a path worn smooth by countless feet over countless centuries, and he followed it with a mixture of reverence and melancholy. The silence was the first thing that struck him. In the stories his grandmother had told, Delphi was always bustling with activity. Pilgrims from across the known world, kings and peasants alike, waiting in long lines for their chance to pose questions to the oracle. Priests in flowing robes tending to sacred rites, merchants selling offerings and souvenirs, musicians playing hymns to Apollo, the air thick with incense and anticipation and the electric crackle of divine presence. Now there was only the wind, sighing through the empty colonnades and rustling the weeds that grew between the paving stones. A few birds called from the surrounding trees. Somewhere, water trickled from a forgotten fountain, but of human presence there was almost no sign. Almost. As Alexios climbed higher, passing the ruins of treasure houses whose plaques still bore the names of cities that had once competed to honor the god with their finest offerings, he began to notice small signs of habitation. A doorway swept clean of debris, a window with cloth covering the opening, a thin trail of smoke rising from behind a crumbling wall. He followed these signs towards the great temple itself, the massive structure that had once been the heart of the ancient world, where the Pythia sat upon her tripod and spoke the words of Apollo to all who came seeking truth. The columns still stood, most of them, though gaps in their ranks showed where earthquakes and time had taken their toll. The roof was partially collapsed, open to the sky in places, and birds nested in the corners, where gilt decorations had once gleamed. Alexios climbed the worn steps and passed between the columns into the temple proper. The interior was dim, lit only by the afternoon light filtering through the gaps in the roof, and by a single source of illumination at the far end of the great hall. A fire burned there in a bronze brazier that stood before the inner sanctum, but it was a pitiful thing, barely more than embers, flickering weakly as if it might go out at any moment. This, Alexios realized with a chill, must be the sacred flame he had come to rekindle. The flame that connected the mortal world to the realm of the gods. And it was dying. Beside the brazier sat a figure wrapped in dark robes, hunched and motionless. For a moment, Alexios thought it might be a statue, some forgotten idol left behind when the temple fell into disuse. But then the figure stirred, turning slowly toward him, and he saw that it was a woman. She was ancient, the oldest living person Alexios had ever seen, her face a map of wrinkles, her hair white as snow and thin as spider silk. Her eyes were clouded, nearly blind, but they fixed on him with an intensity that made him feel she could see straight through to his soul. She wore the traditional robes of a priestess, faded and patched but still recognizable, and around her neck hung a golden serpent, the symbol of prophecy. "So," she said, and her voice was surprisingly strong, a clear bell in the dusty silence of the temple. "The shepherd has come, at last." Alexios stopped short. "You know who I am?" "I know many things," the old woman replied. "Or I did once. Now I know only what Apollo whispers to me in my dreams, and his whispers grow fainter with each passing year." She gestured to the dying flame. "As his fire dims, so does his voice. Soon there will be only silence." Alexios approached slowly, reverently, stopping a respectful distance from the brazier and the ancient priestess. "You are the Pythia," he said, "the Oracle of Delphi." "I am what remains of her," the old woman agreed. "The last of a long line, stretching back to the beginning of days. My sisters are gone one by one, called home to the gods, or simply faded away like morning mist. I remain because someone must tend the flame, even when it burns so low. Someone must listen for the whispers, even when they can barely be heard." "I have come to help," Alexios said. "If I can. I was told that the flame could be rekindled if the right offering was made." The Pythia studied him with those clouded eyes, and Alexios felt himself being measured, weighed, assessed in some way he could not understand. "Many have come with similar claims," she said finally. "Kings and generals, merchants and philosophers. They brought gold and jewels, cattle and wine, all the treasures of the earth, and the flame accepted none of it. It continued to fade, indifferent to their costly offerings." "I have no gold," Alexios admitted. "No jewels or cattle. I am only a shepherd with nothing of value to give. Oh, nothing of value." The Pythia's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "And yet the gods sent you dreams of this place, and yet you traveled many days to reach us, and yet you stand before the dying flame with faith still burning in your heart." She leaned forward, her blind eyes somehow finding his. "Tell me, shepherd, what do you believe?" The question caught Alexios off guard. He had expected to be asked what he wanted, what he sought, what question he wished to pose to the oracle, not this simple fundamental inquiry into the nature of his faith. "I believe," he said slowly, thinking carefully about his words, "that the world is more than what we can see and touch. I believe that there is wonder hidden in every stream and stone, mystery in every sunrise, magic in every act of kindness between strangers. I believe that the old stories my grandmother told me were not just stories, but echoes of a truth too large for ordinary words to contain." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I believe that the gods exist, not because I have seen them, though I have now, but because the alternative, a world without wonder, without meaning, without connection to something greater than ourselves, seems too bleak to bear. I believe that faith is not foolishness, that reverence is not weakness, that holding on to hope in the face of doubt is the most human thing we can do." The temple was silent when he finished. The dying flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the ancient walls. The Pythia sat motionless, her face unreadable. Then she smiled, a real smile this time, warm and surprisingly young on her ancient face. "Well spoken, shepherd, well spoken indeed." She rose to her feet with surprising grace for one so old, steadying herself with one hand on the edge of the brazier. "The flame requires 3 things to be rekindled: a prayer offered with sincere heart, a gift given from genuine love, and a song sung with true joy. Can you provide these things?" Alexios nodded slowly. "I can try." "Then approach the flame, kneel before it, and let your faith speak through your actions." Alexios moved forward until he stood directly before the brazier, close enough to feel the faint warmth of the dying embers. He knelt on the cold stone floor, setting his staff aside, and took a deep breath. The prayer came first. He had not prayed formally since his grandmother's death. The words of the traditional invocations had faded from his memory, replaced by the simple conversations he held with the world around him, with the mountains and the sheep and the stars. But now, kneeling before this ancient flame, he reached for something deeper. "Ah, Apollo," he said softly, "Lord of light, God of truth and prophecy and all the arts that make life beautiful. I do not know the proper words to address you. I am not a priest, not a philosopher, not anyone of importance. I am only a shepherd who was taught to believe in things greater than himself." He closed his eyes, letting the words flow from somewhere deep within. "I pray not for myself, but for the world, for the wonder that is fading from mortal hearts, for the magic that is draining from streams and stones, for the connection between earth and sky that has sustained us since the beginning. Please, if you can hear me, if my words have any meaning, let this flame burn bright again. Let the old bonds be restored. Let belief once more kindle faith, and faith once more kindle fire." He fell silent, and for a long moment nothing happened. The flame continued to flicker, weak and pale. Alexios felt a crushing wave of disappointment begin to build in his chest. Then he remembered the second requirement, a gift given from genuine love. He reached into his pouch and withdrew the small object that had traveled with him from Mount Pelion, A ring, silver and worn smooth by years of wear, set with a tiny chip of blue stone that caught the light like a fragment of sky. It had belonged to his grandmother, given to her by his grandfather on the day they wed, worn on her finger every day of her life until the fever took her, and Alexios had removed it from her cooling hand. It was the only thing of hers he had kept, the only physical connection to the woman who had raised him, loved him, filled his head with stories, and his heart with faith. It was worth nothing in gold, but it was priceless beyond measure. Alexios held the ring over the dying flame. "This belonged to someone who believed," he said, his voice thick. "Someone who kept the old ways when everyone around her was forgetting. Someone who taught a frightened orphan that the world was full of wonder, if only he had eyes to see it." He opened his fingers, letting the ring drop into the embers. "I give it to you not because it has value, but because it has love. All the love of a grandmother for her grandson, and all the love of a grandson who still remembers." The ring disappeared into the coals, and for a moment nothing changed. Then a tiny spark leapt up from where it had fallen, a small tongue of true flame, golden and bright, where before there had been only red embers. Alexios's breath caught in his throat. The song. He still needed to offer a song. His hands trembled as he reached for the magical lyre that Hermes had given him. He had no gift for music, could barely carry a tune when singing to his sheep. But the god had said the lyre would play itself, would respond to the music in his heart. Alexios held the small instrument, feeling its warmth against his palms, and thought about joy. He thought about mornings on Mount Pelion, the sun rising over the peaks, the world fresh and clean and full of possibility. He thought about his grandmother's laughter, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the warmth of her hand in his when he was small and afraid. He thought about the sacred grove, the shimmering olive trees, the luminous spring, the moment when he realized that the stories were true, that wonder still existed in the world. The lyre began to play. The sound was unlike anything Alexios had ever heard. It was not merely music, but something more, something that bypassed his ears entirely and spoke directly to his soul. It was the sound of sunrise over mountains, of wind through olive leaves, of laughter shared between loved ones, of faith rewarded and hope fulfilled. It was joy made audible, belief transformed into melody. The flame responded. It grew slowly at first, then faster, rising from the embers like a flower blooming in the spring, gold and white and brilliant blue colors that no ordinary fire could produce, dancing and swirling in patterns that seemed almost alive. The heat of it washed over Alexios's face, not burning but blessing, filling him with warmth that penetrated to his very bones. The Pythia had risen to her feet, her blind eyes wide, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "He speaks," she breathed. "After so long he speaks again. Apollo, my lord, my god, I hear you, I hear you." The flame roared higher, filling the temple with light, driving the shadows from every corner. The birds that had nested in the rafters took flight, streaming out through the gaps in the roof, their calls mixing with the music of the lyre. The wind rose, swirling through the columns, carrying the scent of laurel and incense, and then as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The flame settled back to a normal size, but it was a normal size of vigorous, healthy fire, burning strong and steady in the bronze brazier. The lyre fell silent in Alexios's hands. The wind died down. The temple was still once more, but it was a different stillness now. Not the silence of abandonment, but the peace of a sacred space that had remembered its purpose. The Pythia approached Alexios, her steps sure despite her age and blindness. She reached out and took his hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "You have done it," she said. "The first flame burns again. The bond between Apollo and the mortal world is restored." She squeezed his hands. "The god is pleased. He wishes me to give you a gift, a word of guidance for the journey ahead." Alexios nodded, not trusting his voice. The Pythia's eyes rolled back, showing white, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. It was deeper, resonant, carrying harmonics that no human throat should produce. "Seek the smith beneath the mountain," she intoned, "where fire meets stone and stone meets fire. He who was cast down knows the pain of rejection. Heal his wounded heart, and his flame will burn for you." Her eyes returned to normal, and she released his hand, swaying slightly. Alexios steadied her, helping her back to her seat beside the brazier. "The forge of Hephaestus," she said in her normal voice. "That is where you must go next. It will not be easy. The smith god is bitter, wounded by ancient wrongs, but if anyone can reach him, I believe it might be you." Alexios looked at the renewed flame, at the light it cast on the old stones, at the hope it represented. "I will try," he said, "as I did here. It is all I can do." The Pythia smiled. "Sometimes, shepherd, trying is enough. Go now. Rest tonight in the pilgrims' quarters. There is still a bed there, and food and water from the sacred spring. Tomorrow begin the next leg of your journey." Alexios bowed deeply, honoring the priestess and the god she served. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." "Thank yourself," she replied. "I did nothing but watch. The faith was yours. The love was yours. The joy was yours. I merely provided the stage upon which they could perform." As Alexios left the temple, he paused at the entrance to look back. The flame burned steadily in its brazier, casting warm light through the ancient hall. The Pythia sat beside it, her hands raised in prayer, her lips moving in words he could not hear. One flame rekindled, 2 more to go. The shepherd squared his shoulders and walked out into the gathering dusk, ready to face whatever trials lay ahead. The journey from Delphi to the forge of Hephaestus took Alexios across land and sea, through territories he had never imagined seeing, and experiences he could not have dreamed. The Pythia had given him directions before he left, cryptic as oracular guidance tended to be, but clear enough to follow. West to the coast, a ship to the islands, then south and west again, toward the great burning mountain, where the god of the forge made his home. The first part was simple enough. Alexios descended from Delphi's heights and followed the road westward until he reached the port city of Atea. nestled in the curve of a blue bay. It was larger than Volos, busier, filled with sailors and merchants from across the Mediterranean. The harbor was crowded with ships of every size, from small fishing boats to great trading vessels with multiple sails and crews of dozens. Alexios had never been on a ship in his life. The sea had always been a distant shimmer from his mountain, beautiful to look at but utterly foreign, a world as alien as the moon. Now he stood on the dock, watching the vessels bob and sway with the waves, and felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach that had nothing to do with the quest. But a shepherd who had rekindled divine flame could hardly balk at a simple boat ride. He found passage on a merchant vessel heading toward the western islands. A sturdy ship with a crew of 15 and a captain who asked few questions as long as Alexios could pay his fare. The magical bread served him well here. He had traded portions of it in the villages along the road, and the travelers he fed always seemed compelled to give him more in return than the bread was worth. Some magic of the gift, perhaps, ensuring that generosity was rewarded with generosity. The sea voyage took 5 days, island hopping through the azure waters of the western Mediterranean. Alexios spent most of his time at the rail, watching the waves and the dolphins that sometimes raced alongside the ship, marveling at the vast expanse of water all around him. His mountains were nowhere to be seen. There was only blue, endless blue, above and below, and in every direction. The sailors were friendly enough, once they got over their initial suspicion of the quiet shepherd with the wooden staff. In the evenings, when the ship was anchored in some sheltered cove, they would gather on deck to share stories and songs. Alexios contributed his magical lyre to these gatherings, and the music it produced never failed to leave the hardened seaman misty-eyed and thoughtful, remembering homes and loved ones far away. "There's something special about you, shepherd," the captain told him one night as the stars wheeled overhead and the ship rocked gently at anchor. "Can't put my finger on what it is, but you've got a light about you, a feeling of good fortune." Alexios thought about sacred groves and dying flames and the weight of divine expectation, but he only smiled and said nothing. On the 5th day, the great burning mountain came into view. It rose from the sea like a giant's tower, its peak wreathed in smoke and its slopes dark with ancient lava flows. Even from miles away, Alexios could see the glow at its summit, the angry red pulse of the fire that burned eternally within. The sailors made signs against evil and muttered prayers to their various gods. The captain altered course to give the mountain a wide berth. "Ah, that's where the smith god lives," one of the older sailors told Alexios, his voice hushed with superstitious awe. "Down in the depths, where the fire never goes out, they say he forges weapons for the gods themselves, thunderbolts for Zeus, arrows for Apollo. They say if you listen at night, when the wind is right, you can hear his hammer ringing against the anvil." "Has anyone ever gone there?" Alexios asked. "To the forge itself?" The sailor laughed, but there was nervousness in it. "And come back to tell the tale, Not that I've ever heard the mountain doesn't welcome visitors, those who try to climb it." He shook his head. "Well, let's just say the smoke isn't the only thing that comes out of that peak." The ship put in at a small fishing village on the far side of the mountain, as close as the captain was willing to sail. Alexios disembarked with thanks and farewells, then stood on the dock watching the vessel sail away until it was just a speck on the horizon. He was alone now, truly alone, with nothing but his staff and his pack and his faith to carry him forward. The village was a poor place, a handful of stone cottages clinging to the rocky shore like barnacles. The people who lived there were fishermen, weathered and tough, who eyed Alexios with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. When he asked about the mountain, about paths to the summit, they shook their heads and refused to speak further. Nothing good comes from that place," an old woman told him, the only one willing to talk at all. "The god who lives there is angry, bitter. He sends tremors through the earth, spits fire into the sky. We leave offerings at the base of the mountain, hoping to appease him, but he never acknowledges them." "Where do you leave these offerings?" Alexios asked. The old woman pointed towards a narrow path that wound up from the village into the rocky foothills. "There's a cave half a day's climb up. We leave food and wine there, sometimes tools or bits of metal. The offerings always disappear, but whether the god takes them or just the wild goats, who can say?" Alexios thanked her and began to climb. The path was treacherous, more goat track than road, winding through tumbled boulders and across fields of sharp volcanic rock. The air grew warmer as he ascended, and the smell of sulfur became increasingly strong, a harsh chemical bite that made his eyes water and his throat burn. Vegetation grew sparse, then vanished entirely, leaving only black stone and ash. He found the cave as the sun was setting, a dark opening in the mountainside marked by the remains of old offerings, clay pots and rusted tools, and the bones of animals sacrificed long ago. It was larger than he had expected, the entrance wide enough for 3 men to walk abreast, and from somewhere deep within came a faint red glow, and the distant sound of ringing metal. Alexios stood at the threshold, feeling the heat wash over him from the depths, and gathered his courage. "Hephaestus," he called, his voice echoing into the darkness. "Lord of the forge, master of fire and craft, I am Alexios, a shepherd from Mount Pelion. I come not to demand or to steal, but to speak with you, if you will hear me." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then the ringing stopped. Footsteps echoed from the cave, heavy and uneven, and something emerged from the darkness. It was a man, or something shaped like a man, massive and muscled beyond anything Alexios had ever seen. His arms were thick as tree trunks, corded with muscle and scarred from countless burns. His face was broad and rough-featured, with a beard of copper wire that glinted in the dying light. He walked with a pronounced limp, one leg shorter than the other, and he leaned on a great iron staff that rang against the stone with each step. But it was his eyes that captured Alexios's attention. They were the color of molten metal, orange and gold, and they held a weight of bitterness and pain that made the shepherd's heart ache just to look at them. "A shepherd," the god said, his voice like the rumble of distant thunder. "Come to speak with me," he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The last mortal who dared enter my domain was a king seeking weapons for conquest. I sent him away with his beard on fire and a lesson in humility. Why should I treat you any differently?" Alexios swallowed hard, but held his ground. "Because I am not seeking weapons," he said. "I am not seeking anything for myself. I come on behalf of all mortals and all gods to ask for your help." Her face just studied him with those molten eyes, and Alexios felt himself being measured, just as he had been measured by the Pythia at Delphi. "You speak pretty words," the god said finally, "but words are cheap, even pretty ones. Come, walk with me into my forge, see what I see, then tell me again about helping gods and mortals." He turned and limped back into the cave, not waiting to see if Alexios would follow. After a moment's hesitation, the shepherd did. The tunnel descended steeply, carved through the living rock by forces Alexios could not imagine. The walls glowed with inner heat, and the air grew thick and hard to breathe. Soon he was sweating profusely, wiping his brow with his sleeve, struggling to keep up with the god's surprisingly quick pace. And then the tunnel opened out, and Alexios saw the forge of Hephaestus. It was a cavern so vast that the ceiling was lost in smoke and shadow. Rivers of molten rock flowed through channels carved in the floor, providing both light and heat. Great anvils stood at intervals, each one larger than a house, surrounded by tools of every description, hammers and tongs and files and chisels, some sized for human hands and some sized for giants. Chains hung from the ceiling, supporting crucibles and molds and half-finished works of metal art. And everywhere there was motion. Bronze automatons, mechanical men with jointed limbs and glowing eyes, tended the forges and hauled materials and performed 1,000 tasks. They moved with fluid grace, their metal bodies impervious to the heat that would have killed any mortal in seconds. Among them worked other creatures, massive one-eyed giants with hands like shovels and expressions of simple concentration, the legendary Cyclopes who had helped forge the weapons of the gods since time began. It was, Alexios thought, the most amazing thing he had ever seen, and also the most terrifying. Hephaestus led him to a smaller chamber off the main forge, where a fire burned in a brazier similar to the one at Delphi. But this fire was weak, barely more than embers, just as the oracle's flame had been. The sacred fire of the forge dying along with belief. "Do you see?" the god asked, gesturing at the pitiful flame. "This is what remains of my connection to your world. Once, every smith who lit his forge invoked my name. Every blade, every plowshare, every nail and chain and hinge was made with a prayer to Hephaestus on the craftsman's lips. I was honored, I was remembered, I was part of something." He turned away from the flame, his scarred face twisted with old pain. Now they have forgotten. They light their forges without prayers. They forge their metals without reverence. They create without acknowledging the god who taught their ancestors the secrets of the craft. He laughed that bitter laugh again. And why should they remember? Why should anyone remember the crippled god, the ugly one, the one who was thrown from Olympus by his own mother, because he was not beautiful enough to be worthy of heaven? Alexios felt a surge of compassion so strong it was almost physical. "My lord," he said softly, "I did not know the old stories held such pain." "There is much your stories do not tell," Hephaestus replied. "They speak of my works, my creations, the wonders I have forged. They do not speak of the loneliness of the craftsman toiling alone in the dark while others feast in the light above. They do not speak of the rejection, the scorn, the knowledge that I was valued only for what I could make, never for who I was." He sank onto a stone bench, suddenly looking not like a god, but like a very tired, very old man. "Why should I help mortals who have forgotten me? Why should I care if the flame goes out? Let the bonds break, let the world lose its wonder. Perhaps then they will understand what they have lost." Alexios stood in that chamber of fire and metal, looking at the broken god, and thought about what to say. The Pythia's words echoed in his memory. "He who was cast down knows the pain of rejection. Heal his wounded heart, and his flame will burn for you." The shepherd took a deep breath and sat down on the stone floor, cross-legged, looking up at the god like a child listening to an elder's tale. "My lord," he said, "may I tell you a story?" Hephaestus looked at the shepherd with something between amusement and annoyance, his molten eyes flickering in the dim light of the dying flame. "Ah, a story," he repeated. "You sit in the forge of the gods, surrounded by wonders that would drive most mortals mad with desire or terror, and you want to tell me a story. If you will hear it," Alexios said simply. The god studied him for a long moment, then shrugged his massive shoulders. "Very well. I have heard many stories over the ages, most of them lies told by those who wanted something from me. Let us see what tale a shepherd has to offer." Alexios gathered his thoughts, reaching back into his memory for the right words. "In the village at the foot of my mountain," he began, "there lived a blacksmith named Theodoros. He was not a young man when I knew him. His hair had gone gray, his back was bent from years of leaning over his anvil, and his hands were scarred from countless burns and mishaps. He walked with a limp, too, from an accident in his youth when a horse he was shoeing kicked him and shattered his leg." Hephaestus's eyes flickered with something that might have been interest. "Go on." Theodoros was not what anyone would call handsome. His face was rough. His nose had been broken more than once, and his skin was weathered by heat and smoke. The young women of the village did not sigh when he passed, and the young men did not seek to emulate his appearance. By all the measures that people use to judge worth, he was unremarkable. Alexios paused, remembering the old smith's forge, the heat and the smell of hot metal, the ring of hammer on anvil that had been the heartbeat of his village for as long as anyone could remember. But Theodoros was loved," he continued, "not for his looks, not for his wealth, for he had little, but for what he created. Every tool in our village came from his forge. The plows that turned our soil, the knives that cut our bread, the hinges on our doors, and the nails in our roofs. When something broke, Theodoros fixed it. When something was needed, Theodoros made it. He worked from dawn until dusk, and sometimes through the night when the need was urgent, and he never turned anyone away, even those who could not pay." The god was listening now, truly listening, his bitter expression softening almost imperceptibly. "I used to visit his forge when I was a boy," Alexios said. "I would sit in the corner and watch him work, mesmerized by the way he transformed raw metal into useful things. He would let me pump the bellows sometimes, or hold a piece while he shaped it. And as he worked, he would talk." What did he talk about? About the craft, about the importance of doing things right, of taking pride in work well done, even when no one was watching. He said that every object he made carried a piece of his soul, and that someday, long after he was gone, those objects would still be serving people, still making their lives a little better. Alexios smiled at the memory. He said that was a kind of immortality, better than any statue or song. To know that the work of your hands would outlast you, would continue to matter after you had returned to the earth. Hephaestus was silent for a long moment. "This blacksmith," he said finally. "He sounds like a man who understood the true purpose of the craft. He did. And when he died, the whole village mourned, not because he was handsome or wealthy or powerful, but because he had given so much of himself to us through his work. Every time someone uses one of his tools, they remember him. Every time a door swings on hinges he made, or a farmer turns soil with one of his plows, Theodoros lives on." Alexios rose to his feet, facing the god directly. "My lord, the people of the world have not forgotten you. They have forgotten your name, perhaps, forgotten the prayers and the rituals. But every time a smith lights a forge, every time a craftsman shapes metal with skill and care, every time someone creates something useful and beautiful with their hands, they are honoring you. They are continuing the work you began when you first taught mortals the secrets of fire and metal." Hephaestus said nothing, but his expression had changed. The bitterness was still there, but it was joined now by something else. Hope, perhaps, or the memory of hope. Alexios reached into his pack and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. It was his knife, the one he used every day to cut rope and trim hooves and perform 100 small tasks around the farm. The blade was bronze, the handle simple wood, the whole thing worn smooth by years of use. It was not beautiful or valuable or special in any way, except that it was his, except that it had been given to him by Theodoros, the last gift the old smith ever made, pressed into his hands on the man's deathbed with the admonition to take care of it, to use it well, to remember. "This is all I have to offer," Alexios said, holding out the knife. "A simple tool made by a simple man, used by a simple shepherd. But it was made with love, and it has been used with gratitude, and every mark and scratch on its surface is a story of work done and needs met." Hephaestus reached out and took the knife with surprising gentleness, turning it over in his massive, scarred hands, examining it with the eye of a master craftsman. "The balance is good," he said quietly. "The edge has been maintained properly. The handle is worn to fit a specific hand." He looked up at Alexios. "This was made by someone who cared. Yes, and I have cared for it in turn, as mortals care for all the things your sacred craft produces, as they will always care, even if they have forgotten who first taught them how." The god held the knife for a long moment, something shifting behind his molten eyes. Then he did something that surprised Alexios completely. He laughed, not the bitter, hollow laugh of before, but a real laugh, deep and warm, echoing off the stone walls of the chamber. It was the laugh of someone who has been carrying a heavy burden for a very long time, and has just discovered that the weight is not as crushing as he thought. "You are an unusual mortal, shepherd," Hephaestus said, still chuckling. "Most who come to me want weapons of power, armor of invincibility, tools to dominate and destroy. You bring me a worn old knife and a story about a village blacksmith, and somehow—" He shook his head in wonder. "Somehow, it is exactly what I needed to hear." He rose from his bench, and his posture had changed. He stood straighter now, his shoulders back, some of the ancient pain lifting from his features. "Come," he said, "let us rekindle this flame together." He led Alexios to the brazier with the dying embers, the sacred fire that connected his forge to the mortal world. The god knelt before it, his massive frame somehow graceful despite its size and imperfection, and gestured for Alexios to kneel beside him. "The fire of the forge is different from Apollo's flame," Hephaestus explained. "It does not require prayer or song or gifts of sentiment. It requires work, honest labor, performed with skill and dedication. It is rekindled not by words but by actions." He reached for a set of bellows mounted beside the brazier and handed them to Alexios. "Pump," he instructed. "Steadily, rhythmically. Feed the fire with air as you would feed it with fuel." Alexios took the bellows and began to work them, falling into a rhythm that felt natural, that reminded him of long afternoons in Theodorus's forge. Air rushed into the embers, which began to glow more brightly, orange deepening to yellow, yellow brightening toward white. Hephaestus, meanwhile, had taken up a hammer and a piece of raw iron. He began to work the metal, heating it in the growing flames, then shaping it on a small anvil with precise, powerful strokes. The ringing of his hammer filled the chamber, a sound that was music and prayer and worship all in one. "Every stroke is an offering," the god said as he worked. "Every blow of the hammer, every shaping of the metal. This is how a smith prays. This is how we honor the sacred fire." Alexios pumped the bellows harder, feeling sweat pour down his face, his arms beginning to ache with the effort. But he did not stop. He thought of Theodorus, of all the smiths who had ever stood before their forges, of the endless line of craftsmen stretching back to the dawn of time, each one adding their labor to the great work that Hephaestus had begun. The fire grew brighter. The embers became flames, red and orange and yellow and white, dancing and roaring in the brazier. The heat was intense, almost unbearable, but Alexios kept pumping, and Hephaestus kept hammering, and together they fed the sacred fire with the only offering it would accept: work. Honest, skilled, dedicated work. The flame reached a peak, blazing so bright that Alexios had to shield his eyes. He felt something shift in the air, a change in pressure, as if a door long closed had suddenly swung open. The connection between the forge and the mortal world re-established, the bonds that allowed divine craft to flow into human hands restored, and then it was done. The flames settled back to a normal level, but it was a strong, healthy flame now, burning steadily in its brazier. Hephaestus set down his hammer and examined the piece he had been working, a small figurine that had taken shape under his skilled hands. It was a sheep, a perfect tiny sheep, every curl of wool rendered in gleaming bronze, every detail of face and hoof captured with loving precision. It was the size of Alexios's palm, warm from the forge fire, and it seemed almost to breathe as the firelight played across its surface. "For you," Hephaestus said, pressing the figurine into Alexios's hands. "A gift from my forge made with the fire you helped rekindle. Carry it with you on your journey. Let it remind you of what we accomplished here today." Alexios cradled the small bronze sheep, marveling at its beauty, at the skill and care evident in every tiny detail. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "for the gift and for listening to my story." "Thank you," Hephaestus replied, "for telling it, for reminding me why I began this work ages ago when the world was young, not for glory or worship or the approval of Olympus, but because creating things is what I was made to do, and helping others create is how I serve the world." He walked Alexios back through the great forge, past the working automatons and the laboring cyclopes, through tunnels of stone and fire, until they stood once more at the cave entrance. The sun was rising over the sea, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the air was blessedly cool after the heat of the depths. "The third flame is Poseidon's," Hephaestus said. "He keeps it in a temple by the sea, in a land far to the east of here. My brother is proud and quick to anger, but he is not unjust. Approach him with the same sincerity you showed me, and I believe he will hear you." "I will try," Alexios said, as he had said before and would no doubt say again. "I know you will." The god clasped Alexios's shoulder with one massive hand. "Go with my blessing, shepherd, and know that the forges of the world burn a little brighter because of what you did today." Alexios bowed deeply, then turned and began the long descent back toward the village in the sea. Behind him, the great mountain rumbled softly, and a plume of smoke rose from its peak, but it seemed somehow friendlier now, less threatening. In his pack, the small bronze sheep nestled beside the magical bread and the guiding feather and the self-playing lyre. 2 flames rekindled, 1 more to go. The voyage from the burning mountain back to the eastern shores of Greece took longer than Alexios had expected. Ships were scarce in these waters, and those few captains willing to take passengers were cautious about their routes, wary of storms and pirates and the general uncertainty of the seas. Alexios found himself island hopping once more, catching rides on fishing boats and merchant vessels, sleeping on beaches when no other shelter was available, and slowly making his way toward the final destination of his quest. He had time to think during those long days of travel, time to reflect on everything he had experienced since leaving his mountain, on the gods he had met and the flames he had rekindled, on the strange path his life had taken from simple shepherd to champion of the divine. It still seemed unreal sometimes, like a dream he would wake from to find himself back in his cottage with his flock bleating outside and the familiar peaks of Pelion rising above. But the bronze sheep in his pack was real. The memory of Apollo's flame blazing back to life was real. The feeling of Hephaestus's massive hand on his shoulder was real. Whatever else might be uncertain, these things he could hold on to. The silver feather guided him eastward, always pointing the way when he became uncertain of his direction. The magical bread sustained him when other food was scarce. The self-playing lyre provided comfort on lonely nights, filling the darkness with melodies that seemed to ease his heart no matter how weary or worried he became. It was on the 15th day after leaving Hephaestus's forge that Alexios finally reached his destination. The village was called Sunion, though he did not learn this until later. It clung to the cliffs at the southeastern tip of the Attic Peninsula, a small collection of whitewashed houses overlooking a sea that stretched unbroken to the horizon. The people here were fishermen, as the people of the volcanic island had been, their lives ruled by the rhythms of tide and weather, their fortunes tied to the bounty of the waters that surrounded them. But something was wrong in Sunion. Alexios sensed it even before he entered the village, a heaviness in the air, a sadness that seemed to hang over the little community like a fog. The boats pulled up on the beach were weathered and neglected. The nets hung limply from their racks, tangled and torn. The people who moved through the narrow streets did so with their heads down, their shoulders slumped, the posture of those who have lost hope. He found lodging at a small inn near the harbor, run by an elderly couple who seemed surprised that anyone would want to visit their village. They gave him a room and a meal of bread and olives and cheese, simple fare that was nevertheless welcome after his long journey, and they answered his questions with the weary patience of those who have told the same sad story many times. "The fish are gone," the old man explained, his weathered face creased with worry. "Started maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3. The catches got smaller and smaller until now there are days when the boats come back with nothing at all. The young people have started leaving, going to the cities to find other work. Soon there will be no one left. And the storms," his wife added, her voice barely above a whisper. "Such storms as we have never seen. They come without warning, rising up from calm seas, smashing boats and drowning men. We have lost 6 fishermen in the past year alone. 6 good men swallowed by waves that appeared from nowhere. The old ones say it is the god's anger," the man continued. "Poseidon, lord of the seas. They say we have offended him somehow, that he has turned his face from us, but we do not know what we have done or how to make it right." Alexios thought about the dying flames he had seen at Delphi and beneath the burning mountain, the fading connection between gods and mortals, the weakening of bonds that had sustained both worlds for millennia. "There is a temple here," he said, "a temple to Poseidon. On the cliffs above the village is it still tended?" The old couple exchanged a glance heavy with guilt and sorrow. "The temple," the woman said softly. "No, it has not been tended in many years. The old priest died, and no one came to take his place. The people stopped visiting, stopped making offerings. There seemed no point when the god no longer answered our prayers. Will you show me the way to it? They looked at him with something between hope and fear, as if unsure whether he was a savior or a madman. But they gave him directions, pointing toward a path that wound up the cliffs to where the ancient temple stood, overlooking the sea. Alexios set out the next morning, climbing the steep trail as the sun rose over the water, turning the sea to gold and bronze. The path was overgrown, clearly untraveled for years, and he had to push through thorny bushes and clamber over fallen stones. But the view that opened before him as he crested the final rise made every difficulty worthwhile. The temple of Poseidon stood at the very edge of the cliff, its white marble columns rising against the endless blue of sea and sky. It was smaller than the great temple at Delphi, but no less beautiful, designed to harmonize with its setting rather than dominate it. The columns were slender and elegant, carved with images of dolphins and waves and the great trident that was the sea god's symbol. The floor was a mosaic of blue and green tiles depicting scenes of ships and sea creatures, and the god himself riding his chariot through the foam. But like Delphi, the temple had fallen into disrepair. Weeds grew between the tiles. Birds nested in the capitals of the columns. The altar at the center of the temple was dark and cold, its brazier empty of flame, its surface stained by weather and time. Alexios stood in that beautiful abandoned place, looking out at the sea that had once been Poseidon's domain, and felt the weight of his task pressing down upon him. 2 flames he had rekindled through faith and compassion and honest work. But Poseidon was different from Apollo or Hephaestus. The sea god was proud, volatile, quick to anger, and slow to forgive. The stories his grandmother had told were full of Poseidon's wrath, of cities destroyed and heroes cursed and entire fleets swallowed by vengeful waves. How did one approach such a god? What could a simple shepherd possibly offer to the Lord of all the oceans? He was still pondering this question when he heard footsteps behind him. Alexios turned to find a young woman climbing the last stretch of the path. Her dark hair wind-blown, her feet bare and sure on the rocky ground. She was perhaps 20 years old, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the grey-green color of shallow water over sand. She wore the simple dress of a fisherwoman, faded and patched but clean, and she carried a basket over one arm, filled with wildflowers and small offerings. She stopped short when she saw him, surprise evident on her features. "I did not expect to find anyone here," she said, her voice carrying a slight breathlessness from the climb. "No one comes to the temple anymore, not for years." "I am a traveler," Alexios replied. "I came to see the temple and to—" He hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "To pay my respects to the god." The young woman's expression shifted, suspicion giving way to something like hope. "You believe in Poseidon? You still honor the old ways?" "I do. My grandmother taught me the old stories, the old prayers. I have come a long way to be here." She studied him for a long moment. Those sea-colored eyes, searching his face as if looking for signs of deception. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly and approached the temple. "My name is Callista," she said. "I am the daughter of Nikolaos the fisherman, or I was, until the sea took him last winter." Her voice was steady, but Alexios could hear the grief beneath it. "I still come here when I can. I still bring offerings, even though the god does not seem to hear them anymore." She set her basket on the altar and began to arrange its contents. Wildflowers picked from the cliff-top meadows, a small cake of honey and grain, a clay cup filled with wine. Simple offerings, the kind a poor village could afford, given with evident sincerity. "My father taught me that we must honor the sea," Callista continued, not looking at Alexios as she worked. "Even when it takes from us, even when it seems cruel, the sea gives life to our village. It feeds us, connects us to the wider world, defines who we are. To turn away from it in anger would be to turn away from ourselves. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was the best of men." Now she did look at him, and there were tears in her eyes, though they did not fall. And the sea took him anyway, took him in a storm that came from nowhere, that lasted only an hour, but was enough to swallow his boat and everyone aboard. I do not understand why the god would do such a thing, but I will not stop honoring him because I do not understand. Alexios felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of kindred spirit. This young woman who had lost so much to the sea's capricious fury still climbed this cliff to bring offerings to an abandoned temple. Still believed, still hoped, still honored the old ways despite every reason to turn away in bitterness. "Callista," he said slowly, "I think perhaps we are here for the same reason, and I think perhaps we can help each other." She raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "I have a story to tell you," Alexios said. "A strange story about sacred groves and dying flames and a quest to restore the bonds between gods and mortals. Will you hear it?" Callista looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I will hear it," she said. "And then perhaps we can decide together what should be done." They sat on the temple steps as the sun climbed higher, the sea stretching infinite and blue before them, and Alexios told his tale. He told her of Hermes and the sacred grove, of the 3 flames that were fading, of his journey to Delphi and beneath the burning mountain. He showed her the bronze sheep from Hephaestus's forge, the magical bread that never ran out, the silver feather that always pointed north. He held nothing back, sensing that this woman deserved the full truth, that anything less would be an insult to her faith. When he finished, Callista was silent for a long time, staring out at the sea. "So the flames are dying because people have stopped believing," she said finally. "And if they go out entirely, the connection between our world and theirs will be severed forever." "Yes. And you have rekindled 2 of the 3. "Yes. And now you need to rekindle Poseidon's flame." She gestured at the cold, dark altar, "the flame that should burn here, in this abandoned temple." "Yes." Callista rose to her feet and walked to the edge of the cliff, looking down at the waves crashing against the rocks far below. My father used to say that the sea reflects the hearts of those who sail upon it, that Poseidon does not create storms from nothing but amplifies what is already there. Fear becomes terror, anger becomes rage, but also love becomes devotion, gratitude becomes blessing. She turned back to face Alexios. If the god's anger is truly a reflection of our own failing, then perhaps what he needs is not grand offerings or elaborate rituals. Perhaps what he needs is simply for someone to remember why the sea matters, why it deserves our reverence even when it frightens us. Alexios rose and went to stand beside her at the cliff's edge. What do you suggest? Callista's eyes were bright, with something that might have been determination, or might have been faith. Tomorrow we gather the village, everyone who can still walk, everyone who still remembers what it meant to honor the sea. We come here together and we clean this temple. We restore it with our own hands, not because we expect the god to reward us, but because it is right. Because our ancestors built it in gratitude, and we have let their work fall to ruin. She looked at him directly. And then, when the temple is clean and the altar is ready, you do whatever it is you did at Delphi and beneath the mountain. You offer your faith, your heart, your sincere reverence, and we will see if Poseidon is listening. Alexios smiled, feeling hope kindle in his chest like a flame catching on dry tinder. I think, he said, that is an excellent plan. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, clouds piling on the horizon like mountains made of mist. The sea was restless, waves chopping against the cliffs with a rhythm that seemed almost angry, and more than one villager looked up at the sky with worry in their eyes. But Callista had been busy the night before, going from house to house speaking to the old and the young alike, reminding them of the temple on the cliff and the god it had once honored. Some had scoffed, dismissing her as a dreamer clinging to superstitions that had no place in the modern world. But others had listened, had remembered, had felt something stir in their hearts at the mention of the old ways. By mid-morning, a small procession was making its way up the cliff path. Perhaps 30 people in all, a mixture of weathered fishermen and their wives, elderly folk who remembered when the temple had been tended, children dragged along by parents who were not quite sure why they were going, but felt compelled to go nonetheless. They carried brooms and brushes, buckets and rags, simple tools for a simple task. Alexios walked among them, answering questions when asked, offering encouragement when needed, but mostly staying quiet and letting Callista lead. This was her village, her people, her sacred place. He was only a shepherd from a distant mountain, here to play whatever role the gods had assigned him. The work began slowly, uncertainly. Years of neglect had left the temple in sorry condition, and many of the villagers seemed overwhelmed by the scale of what needed to be done. But Callista set the example, taking a broom and beginning to sweep the mosaic floor with steady, determined strokes, and gradually others joined her. The old women gathered the weeds that had grown between the tiles, pulling them out by the roots and tossing them over the cliff to the sea below. The old men set to work on the fallen stones, using rope and muscle to lever them back into place. The younger folks scrubbed the columns with seawater and sand, polishing away years of grime and bird droppings, revealing the beautiful carvings beneath. As the morning wore on, something changed in the mood of the workers. What had begun as grudging effort became genuine engagement. People who had not spoken to each other in months found themselves working side by side, sharing stories and memories of the temple as it had been in their youth. Laughter began to echo among the columns, and the sound seemed to push back the grey clouds, letting patches of blue sky show through. By afternoon, the temple was transformed. Not restored to its ancient glory, of course. Years of decay could not be undone in a single day, but cleaned and cared for, made ready to serve its purpose once more. The mosaic floor gleamed in the sunlight that now streamed down from a clearing sky. The columns stood proud and white against the blue of sea and heaven. The altar was scrubbed clean, its brazier empty but waiting, ready to receive the sacred flame. Callista stood before the altar, her face flushed with exertion but radiant with something deeper, satisfaction perhaps, or the joy of work done well. "It is ready," she said, looking at Alexios. "Whatever you need to do, the temple is ready." But Alexios was not looking at the temple. He was looking at the sea. Something was happening out there. The waves that had been merely restless all morning were growing larger, more violent. The wind was picking up, whipping through the columns with a sound like distant roaring. On the horizon, a wall of dark cloud was building, shot through with flickers of lightning. "A storm?" one of the old fishermen said, his voice tight with fear. "Coming fast. We should get down to the village, secure the boats." But Alexios knew with a certainty that went beyond rational thought that this was no ordinary storm. This was Poseidon rising to meet them. The Lord of the Seas responding to the cleansing of his temple with a display of power that could be either blessing or destruction. The choice, he suspected, was not yet made. "Go," he told the villagers. "Take the children and the elderly and go back to the village. Secure what you can, but do not be afraid. This storm is not for you." "And what about you?" Callista demanded, her gray-green eyes fierce. "I have to stay. I have to face him." "Then I stay too." Her voice left no room for argument. "My father gave his life to this sea. I will not run from it now." The other villagers hesitated, clearly torn between fear and loyalty. But in the end, practicality won out. They hurried down the cliff path, casting worried glances back at the temple and the two figures who remained standing before the altar. The storm came faster than any natural weather could move. Within minutes, the sky had gone from patchy blue to solid black, and rain began to fall in sheets so heavy that Alexios could barely see the altar 5 feet in front of him. The wind howled through the columns, tearing at his clothes, threatening to knock him from his feet. Lightning split the darkness, followed immediately by thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very stones of the temple. And then the sea rose. Alexios watched in awe and terror as a wave climbed from the churning water below, towering higher and higher, impossibly high, until it loomed over the cliff top itself. Within the wave, he could see a shape taking form, a figure of foam and fury, massive beyond comprehension, with eyes like whirlpools and hair like kelp. and a trident clutched in one enormous hand. Poseidon, lord of the seas, had come to his temple. The god's voice was the crash of breakers on stone, the roar of the deepest ocean currents, the howl of every storm that had ever swept across the waters of the world. Who dares to wake me from my slumber? Who dares to call upon the earth-shaker, the storm-bringer, the lord of all that moves upon or beneath the waves? Alexios felt his knees buckle, felt every instinct screaming at him to run, to hide, to prostrate himself before this overwhelming display of divine power. Beside him, Callista had fallen to her knees, not in surrender but in reverence, her head bowed but her spine straight. He thought of Apollo's flame blazing back to life. He thought of Hephaestus laughing in his forge. He thought of his grandmother telling him stories by firelight, her voice calm and certain as she spoke of gods who had once walked among mortals. He did not run. He did not hide. Instead, he stepped forward toward the towering figure of foam and fury and raised his voice against the storm. I am Alexios, a shepherd from Mount Pelion. I have come to rekindle your sacred flame, Lord of the seas. I have come to restore the bond between your realm and ours. The god's laughter was a tsunami of sound, crashing over Alexios and leaving him gasping. A shepherd? A tender of wool and bleating creatures? You think to approach the mighty Poseidon with your simple faith and your mortal prayers? I think to approach you with honesty and respect, Alexios shouted back, surprised by his own courage. I have no offerings of gold or silver. I have no fleets to dedicate to your glory. I have only my belief that the old bonds matter, that the connection between gods and mortals should not be allowed to fade. The mortals forgot me. The god's voice rose to a howl that matched the wind. They abandoned my temples. They ceased their prayers. They sail my seas without reverence, fish my waters without gratitude, poison my depths with their refuse. Why should I not drown them all and start anew? It was Callista who answered, rising to her feet, her voice somehow carrying over the storm. Because we have not all forgotten. Poseidon's terrible gaze swung toward her, and Alexios saw the young woman tremble, but she did not back down. My father died in your waters, Lord of the seas. A storm like this one took him, swallowed his boat, drowned him and his crew. I have every reason to hate you, to curse your name, to turn my back on the sea forever. She stepped forward, standing beside Alexios, facing the god without flinching. But I do not hate you. I cannot hate you, because my father taught me that the sea is not just danger and death, it is life. It feeds us, connects us, makes us who we are. Even in his last moments, I know he did not curse you. He loved the sea too much for that. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the rain, but her voice remained strong. These people cleaned your temple today, not because they expected reward, not because they thought you would spare them from storms, but because it was right, because their ancestors built this place in gratitude, and they were ashamed to have let it fall to ruin. That is what faith looks like, Lord of the Seas, not grand gestures and costly offerings. Just ordinary people remembering why the sacred things matter. The storm seemed to pause, the wind dying for just a moment, the rain lessening. Poseidon's form flickered, the fury in his whirlpool eyes shifting to something more complex, something almost like doubt. Alexios seized the moment. "The flames are dying," he said, his voice calm now, steady. "Apollo's flame at Delphi was nearly out when I arrived. Hephaestus's fire beneath the mountain was barely embers. Both have been rekindled, not through grand rituals or costly sacrifices, but through sincere hearts offering genuine reverence." He gestured at the altar, at the clean brazier waiting for flame. "Your fire can burn again, too. The bond between you and the mortals who sail your seas can be restored, but only if you choose it, only if you are willing to accept that faith can survive even when temples crumble and prayers go unanswered. Only if you believe that the connection is worth preserving." Poseidon was silent, his vast form hovering over the temple. The storm held in abeyance around him. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, the crash of gentle waves rather than the roar of tsunamis. "You ask me to trust, to believe that mortals will remember, will continue to honor the sea, even when I am not watching." "I ask you to give them a chance," Alexios replied, "as Apollo did, as Hephaestus did. The world is changing, Lord of the Seas. The old ways of worship may be fading, but the wonder, the reverence, the connection, those can endure if we do not let bitterness extinguish them." Another long silence. The rain had stopped entirely now, and the clouds were beginning to thin, letting shafts of golden sunlight break through to illuminate the temple. Then Poseidon moved. The great figure of foam and wave reached down, extending one enormous hand toward the altar. From his palm, a droplet of water fell, but it was no ordinary water. It glowed with an inner light, blue and green and silver all at once, and when it struck the brazier it burst into flame. Not ordinary fire, but the fire of the sea itself, blue and white and beautiful, dancing in the brazier like waves frozen in the moment of breaking, casting light that was cool and warm at once. The sacred flame of Poseidon rekindled. "Go, shepherd of Pelion," the god said, and his voice was almost gentle now, the murmur of distant surf. "Tell the mortals that the sea remembers those who remember it. Tell them that Poseidon watches, and that his blessing flows to those who honor the waters with gratitude and respect." He turned his whirlpool gaze to Callista. "And you, daughter of Nikolaos, your father died with my name on his lips, not in curse but in prayer. He asked me to spare his crew, to let them reach shore safely. I could not grant his request. The storm was too strong, the waves too high, but I heard him, and I will not forget." The god began to sink back into the sea, his form dissolving into foam and spray. "The fish will return. The storms will calm. The sea will provide again, as it always has, for those who approach it with love rather than fear." And then he was gone, the great wave collapsing back into the water, leaving only ordinary surf breaking against the cliffs below. The sky cleared as if the storm had never been, brilliant blue from horizon to horizon, the sun warm on the temple stones. Alexios and Callista stood before the altar, looking at the beautiful blue flame that danced in the brazier, listening to the gentle hush of the sea, feeling the peace that had settled over this sacred place. 3 flames, Callista whispered, all 3 rekindled. Alexios nodded slowly, the enormity of what they had accomplished beginning to sink in. The bonds are restored, he said. The connection between gods and mortals endures. Callista turned to look at him, tears still wet on her cheeks, but a smile breaking through like sunshine after rain. Thank you, she said, for coming here, for helping us remember. Thank you, Alexios replied, for your courage, for your faith. I could not have done this alone. They stood together in the temple of Poseidon, 2 ordinary mortals who had helped save something extraordinary as the blue flame danced and the sea sang its eternal song below. The journey home took Alexios many weeks, but for the first time since leaving Mount Pelion, he was not anxious about the time passing. The quest was complete. The 3 sacred flames burned once more. Whatever came next, he had done what he had set out to do. He stayed in Sunion for several days after Poseidon's appearance, helping Callista and the villagers repair their fishing boats and prepare for the return of the sea's bounty. True to the god's word, the fish came back almost immediately, great schools of them filling the waters around the village, more than anyone could remember seeing in years. The fishermen went out with renewed hope and returned with nets bursting, with laughter on their lips and prayers of thanks on their hearts. The temple on the cliff became a gathering place once more. People climbed the path each morning to tend the blue flame, to leave small offerings of flowers and grain, to simply sit in the sacred space and remember what it meant to live in a world where God still watched over mortals. Callista took on the role of unofficial priestess, not through any formal appointment, but simply because she was the one who most clearly understood what the temple represented and what its restoration meant. "Will you come back?" she asked Alexios on the morning of his departure, standing with him on the dock where a ship waited to carry him north. "When your work is done, when you have settled back into your life, will you return to see how we are faring?" Alexios looked at this young woman who had faced down a god, whose faith had burned as bright as any sacred flame, and smiled. "I will," he promised. "This place is part of my story now, and I would like to see how its story continues." She embraced him briefly, fiercely, then stepped back and waved as his ship pulled away from the dock. Alexios watched the village shrink into the distance, watched the white columns of the temple catch the morning sun, watched until everything was just a speck against the vast blue of the sea. Then he turned his face toward home. The voyage north was pleasant, blessed with fair winds and calm waters, and Alexios found himself thinking that perhaps Poseidon was offering one final gift, smooth sailing for the mortal who had helped rekindle his flame. The captain of the ship, a weathered old sailor who had been skeptical of Alexios at first, became almost reverential after the shepherd shared a bit of his magical bread and played the self-playing lyre for the crew one evening. "There's something different about you," the captain said, echoing the words Alexios had heard so many times on his journey. "Something blessed." I don't know what you've done or where you've been, but the gods have their hands on you, that's certain." Alexios did not know how to respond to such observations, so he simply smiled and said nothing. He reached the port of Volos in the last week of summer, when the heat was just beginning to fade, and the first hints of autumn color were appearing in the leaves of the trees. From there, it was a familiar walk up the mountain paths, past villages he had known all his life, past landmarks that felt like old friends welcoming him home. His cottage came into view on the afternoon of a perfect late summer day, the sun slanting golden through the cypress trees, the distant sea shimmering on the horizon. Smoke arose from the chimney, and for a moment Alexios felt a pang of confusion, wondering who could be there, whether old Nikolaos had moved in, whether something had gone wrong in his absence. But as he approached, the door opened, and a familiar figure stepped out. Hermes. The god looked exactly as he had in the sacred grove, youthful and quicksilver, his winged sandals hovering just above the ground, his eyes bright with amusement and something deeper, something that might have been pride. "The shepherd returns," Hermes said, spreading his arms in welcome. "Victorious, no less. I must admit, there were moments when I wondered if I had chosen wisely, but you proved me right at every turn." Alexios stopped a few paces away, suddenly uncertain how to behave in the presence of a god when there was no crisis to face, no flame to rekindle, no grand purpose to fulfill. "I did what needed to be done," he said simply. "Nothing more." "Ah, nothing more," Hermes repeated, and laughed. "You faced Apollo's dying flame and rekindled it with your grandmother's ring and a song of pure joy. You entered Hephaestus's forge and healed a god's wounded heart with stories of a village blacksmith. You stood before Poseidon in all his fury and did not flinch. And you called this nothing more." The god shook his head in wonder. The flames burned strong again. Alexios of Pelion, all three of them brighter than they have been in centuries. The bonds between our worlds are restored, strengthened by your faith and the faith of those you touched along the way. The Pythia speaks prophecy once more. Hephaestus forges with renewed purpose. Poseidon watches over the seas with something other than bitter anger. Hermes moved closer, his expression becoming serious. "You have done something extraordinary, something that no king or hero or philosopher has accomplished in living memory. You have reminded gods and mortals alike what we once meant to each other, what we can still mean if we choose." Alexios felt a flush of embarrassment at such praise. He was still just a shepherd, still just a man who had been in the right place at the right time, and had somehow found the courage not to walk away. "I had help," he said. "The Pythia guided me. Hephaestus taught me. Callista stood beside me when I faced Poseidon. I could not have done any of it alone." "No one ever does anything alone," Hermes agreed. "That is perhaps the most important lesson of all. The bonds between beings, whether mortal or divine, are what give our existence meaning. You understood that instinctively, and that understanding is what made you the right person for this task." The god reached into his cloak and produced a small object, which he pressed into Alexios's hands. It was a coin, gold and gleaming, stamped on one side with the image of a shepherd's staff and on the other with a flame. "Keep this," Hermes said, not as payment, for what you have done cannot be paid for, but as a token of remembrance. When you hold it, know that the gods have not forgotten you, that we are watching, and that we are grateful." Alexios turned the coin over in his fingers, feeling its weight, its warmth. "And my wish?" he asked. "You promised me a boon, a gift in return for my service. I said at the time that I did not seek reward, but—" He trailed off, uncertain how to continue. "But you have thought of something," Hermes finished for him. "Something you would ask for if asking were permitted?" "Yes, then ask." Alexios took a deep breath. "I wish for the gods to remember mortals kindly, to look upon us with compassion, even when we forget your names, even when we neglect your temples, even when we stumble in our faith. We are small and brief and full of flaws, but we are trying. We are always trying, and I hope that counts for something." Hermes was silent for a long moment, those ancient eyes studying Alexios with an expression the shepherd could not read. Then the god smiled, and it was perhaps the most genuine smile Alexios had ever seen. "Of all the wishes I have granted in my long existence," Hermes said quietly, "that may be the finest. Not gold, not power, not eternal life, but compassion, understanding, the hope that your kind will be judged not by your failures, but by your efforts." He reached out and touched Alexios's forehead, a brief brush of divine fingers against mortal skin. "Yeah, it is granted. The gods will remember this wish, and the mortal who made it. When we look upon your world, we will see not just the darkness and the failing, but also the light and the striving. We will remember that you are small but brave, brief but beautiful, flawed but always, always trying." The god stepped back, his form beginning to shimmer, to fade. "Go back to your sheep, Alexios of Pelion. Go back to your simple life and your mountain views and your wooden flute. But know that you have changed things. Know that the stories will remember you, even if the histories do not. And know that whenever you look up at the stars or feel the wind on your face or hear the distant rumble of thunder, we are there. Watching, remembering, grateful." And with that, Hermes vanished, leaving only a faint scent of wild thyme and the whisper of wings. Alexios stood alone before his cottage, holding a golden coin in one hand, feeling the late summer sun warm on his face. The world looked the same as it always had. The same mountains, the same trees, the same distant shimmer of the sea. But everything was different now. Everything was touched with wonder. He found his sheep in the pen, exactly where they should be, tended with care by old Nikolaos, who had indeed been as good as his word. The old man was overjoyed to see him return, full of questions about his journey, about where he had gone, and what he had done. Alexios told him some of it, not all, enough to satisfy curiosity without straining credibility. "Well," Nikolaos said finally, shaking his head in wonder, "I don't pretend to understand half of what you're saying, but you look different, boy. Stronger somehow, more certain. Whatever happened out there, it was good for you." That evening, Alexios sat outside his cottage watching the sun set over the mountains, his sheep grazing contentedly nearby, a cup of wine in his hand and a feeling of deep peace in his heart. The stars came out one by one, the same stars his grandmother had shown him as a child, the same stars that would shine long after he was gone. He thought about all the people he had met on his journey. The Pythia, keeping her lonely vigil at Delphi. Hephaestus, finding purpose again in his forge. Callista, tending the blue flame above the sea. The sailors and villagers and innkeepers who had shared their food and their stories. The mysterious stranger on the road who had blessed his journey with cryptic words. They were all part of his story now, and he was part of theirs. In the days and weeks that followed, life returned to its familiar rhythms. Alexios tended his sheep, made his cheese, played his flute among the wildflowers. The seasons turned summer fading into autumn, autumn darkening into winter, winter brightening into spring. The cycles continued as they always had, as they always would. But something was different now. Word had spread, slowly at first, then faster, of the shepherd who had traveled to distant temples, who had spoken with gods, who had helped rekindle sacred flames. People began to visit, climbing the mountain paths to his cottage, asking for stories, asking for wisdom, asking simply to be in the presence of one who had touched the divine. Alexios told them what he could. He told them about the sacred grove and the shimmering olives. He told them about the Pythia's tears of joy when Apollo spoke again. He told them about Hephaestus's laughter and Poseidon's terrible majesty. He told them about Callista's courage and the blue flame dancing on the clifftop altar. But most of all, he told them about faith, about the power of sincere belief, of genuine reverence, of the connection between ordinary mortals and extraordinary wonder. He told them that the gods had not abandoned them, that the old bonds still held, that magic still lived in the world for those who had eyes to see it. And slowly, gradually, people began to remember. They began to leave offerings at the old shrines, to speak the old prayers, to tell the old stories to their children. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. Enough to keep the flames burning, the bonds holding, the wonder alive. That, Alexios thought, was perhaps the greatest gift of all. Not the adventures he had experienced, not the gods he had met, not the impossible things he had witnessed, but the knowledge that his journey had meant something, that the world was a little brighter, a little more magical, because he had found the courage to say yes when destiny came calling. And now, my dear listeners, we come to the end of our tale. The shepherd returned to his mountain, the gods returned to their watching, and the world continued to turn, as it always has, as it always will. But somewhere in the space between mortal and divine, in the flames that burn in ancient temples and the prayers that rise from hopeful hearts, the bonds endure. Remember that as you drift towards sleep. Remember that wonder is real, that faith is powerful, that the connection between small lives and great mysteries is never truly broken. Remember that you too can be a keeper of flames, a tender of bonds, a guardian of the old stories that make the world magical. And until next time, my dear friends, stay safe and sweet dreams.